To introduce Professor Small received her BA in English from Victoria University of Wellington and her PhD from University of Cambridge. She's Professor of English at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of Pembroke College. Her works include a number of influential studies in 19th century literature, along with her magisterial examination of old age as treated by Western philosophy and literature in a book entitled The Long Life, which, to quote from the author's preface, looks at the implications for old age of certain ways of thinking about what it is to be a person, to have a life, to have or lead a good life, to be part of a just society. And the book goes on to investigate the largely hidden role that ideas about old age have played in thinking on these questions. And for that work, she was awarded the Truman Capote Prize for Literary Criticism and the British Academy's Rosemary Crawshay Prize. Her lecture to us today, I think, is especially timely because in October this year, her work entitled The Value of the Humanities will be published by Oxford University Press, providing an intellectual map of the principal arguments traditionally used to defend the humanities with, I think, quite a bit of top spin. So I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Small.
Thank you, Commissioner. That was genuinely inspiring. And I don't think I can improve upon it. I'm going to do something slightly different. If you're afraid you're going to hear another polemic for the humanities, polemic is not my natural mode. I find myself a natural skeptic. So really the task of the book that Margaret so kindly introduced just then is to give a bit of a hard time to the arguments that we tend to rely upon in the humanities and see what's left standing. Don't worry, there is quite a lot left standing at the end. It might be worth saying the context for this, just a word on autobiography. I live with a former editor of Newsnight and Panorama, to put a name on it exactly. So when the question of how we value the humanities, and specifically the humanities claim to research funding in a context of scarce public funds, came, long sentence, onto the agenda, really with the move to introduce the £9,000 tuition fee maximum that we now have in the UK, and the wider debate about scarce public funds. He would ask me the tough questions over the dinner table. Really, how do you justify what you do, the research claim, especially in this context? And I found that the pieties that were coming to my lips weren't quite satisfying me. So the book is really my attempt to get my own head in order, and I hope it has some wider public value in passing the results on. Okay. Justifying the humanities claim to a share of the public budget for research is, I think, a harder task than defending their claim for support for teaching undergraduates. As one sympathetic UK economist put it to me, you in the humanities have a really difficult task here. I'm not sure it's possible to do it, they said, explaining why the state should pay for more scholarship about Jane Austen or Shakespeare in an age of austerity. And those are the easy cases where you can appeal to your curatorial and explanatory functions as people with special expertise in matters readily understood already as having cultural value. So I think one of the effects of the austerity measures has been to force people like me back on a slightly conservative version of the canon that we work with, going for the things that people already understand that they value or that they ought to value. I've been working on this topic, as I've said, against a background of intense public debate about successive British governments' incremental retreat from the idea that the state should bear most of the economic cost of higher education. But the state still pays, in the EU context, the states, plural, still pay for research in the humanities as they pay also for research in the social sciences. And sciences, of course, they also subsidise graduate research. I'm trying to present a disaster with water on the computer. Let me just move that out the way. The most politically pressing questions at this point with respect to research funding seem to me to be, first, what the state thinks and says that it is paying for in the case of the humanities, what the distinctive contributions are to the public good. And secondly, whether the ways in which the money is spent and accounted for can be changed for the better. So another word of autobiography, this isn't really my point today, but I am speaking also as someone who has been running the Research Excellence Framework exercise for government in the English faculty of Oxford University. And I still have special responsibility for writing the impact case studies. So English will need to return 11 of these to the UK government. I just want to say a word to connect up with this morning's discussion. I absolutely think we need to be better at explaining what the social and economic benefit of what we do is to the wider public and to government. We do need to get our accounting procedures in order. You'll have to wait until the end of this exercise so that I can give you figures. But I think what we're in the midst of in the UK, and I hope that Ireland and the EU can learn from, is a huge overinterpretation of the exercise. So that the kind of the hard questions, as you put it this morning, Orla, that the giving the data on it is becoming in itself a kind of accounting exercise that's running away with us. Okay? And at the point where you start to interview people going into a museum or exhibition at the beginning and at the end and ask them how you changed your lives, I think you might be becoming a public nuisance rather than a public good. Okay? So what are the governments paying for, my subject today? I'm going to identify 5 claims for the value of the humanities, starting with a working definition of what they do. Strictly, that first claim isn't a valuation, it's a justification, but it's the basis on which valuations can go on to be built. And then 4 further claims for the value of what they do, the public value. At the end, I'm going to offer some very brief words about how these claims might feed into decision-making about the respective claims on the public purse of incommensurable but not incomparable goods. That's the how do you rank the humanities against the National Health Service part, if you like, the dinner table question. So first, a definition. Excuse me. The humanities study the meaning-making practices of human culture, past and present, focusing on interpretation and critical evaluation, primarily in terms of the individual response and with an ineliminable element of subjectivity. Anodyne and somewhat ungainly though that claim may be, it says something about a distinctive content, cultural practices, including but not limited to the arts, and a distinctive understanding of what is involved in being truthful, an acceptance that truth claims will not and cannot be founded only on positivistic appeals to evidence, rather that they will necessarily entail the exercise of judgment. That this initial claim says nothing about further requirements often associated with the humanities, historical interpretation, rhetorical analysis, the cultivation of style, creativity, imagination, is because I take these things to be, though vital elements in much of the practice of the humanities, not absolutely generalizable across them. So one of the biggest difficulties in the way of defending the humanities at the general level, as I'm trying to do, the general philosophical level, is coming up with a definition that can comprehend the study of, say, Sufi mysticism, Middle German, the history of plain song, and analytic philosophy. Any well-trained product of a humanities education in this room will immediately, as I've been speaking, have turned a critical eye on the words meaning, culture, individuality, subjectivity, and probably interpretation and evaluation too. That's what we do, and humanities practitioners will be familiar with the question that typically follows about whether that critical response is itself sufficiently definitive of what we do. The claim that the special purpose of the humanities is more and less stringently critical thinking tends to find wide approval within the field. The unexamined intellectual life is not worth defending. But as a core element in a justification for the humanities, it has an obvious question to answer, a questionable assumption of privilege over other fields. The critical methods of the historian, the philosopher, the analyst of rhetoric, and so forth are developed at the highest level within their particular fields, but critical and philosophical reflection are indispensable to intellectual work everywhere. A biochemist or economist or lawyer who just gets on unreflectingly with the current method will be functioning as a competent technician, but not someone who can advance understanding in or of the field. A common line of argument from those advocates for the humanities who have wished to retain a distinctive claim to be concerned with critical inquiry is therefore to say that other fields are behaving humanistically, as opposed to empirically or positivistically when they respond to a proposition by the impulse to test its assumptions. They are, in short, borrowing qualities more commonly associated with the humanities and especially with philosophy. At this point, the description may start to look somewhat imperialistic, and I'm amused to find that behind me is not Plato, who I'll be referring to in a minute, but a bunch of Roman emperors, so much what the Royal Academy had in mind there. But in practice, any proactive effort at dominance over other disciplines is going to prove self-limiting. As the sociologist Andrew Abbott put it, such attempts at expansion of the domain give an aggressive discipline its most extensive cross-section. English, for example, claiming control of everything written in texts because English thinks of itself as the master discipline of the interpretation of texts. For each discipline, there is some dimension of definition along which its projection is greater than that of other disciplines. In moments of aggression, it will emphasize this dimension, although doing so may expose it to insufferable competition. Okay, that's right, I think, but if advancing strong claims for a discipline or a grouping of disciplines can be a gesture of imperial advancement that rightly meets with resistance, it can also, and with better justification, be a protective gesture with regard to particular kinds of inquiry and forms of knowledge. Cross-faculty, cross-discipline, cross-field appropriations of the name of the humanities have particular force at present in contexts where certain kinds of work find themselves without a strong defence internal to the current conduct of the field. So economic study, for example, that neglects economic history. Cognitive psychology that reserves no scepticism about the explanatory reach of brain imaging. Rational choice modelling that fails to consider the uneven possession of agency. Theorising about science that forgets to allow for the perspective of the theorist. In all these cases, the term humanistic operates polemically on the front that most clearly distinguishes a neglected edge of those fields from their aggressive edge. So one can perceive the marginal prestige of the term humanistic within some areas of the social sciences and sciences, and yet know its value in bringing back to notice currently undervalued ways of thinking about the subject, rebalancing the claims of the other disciplines, helping to retain a broader view and sometimes to restore public conviction. It's in such circumstances, offensive and defensive, that the qualities by which the humanities claim distinctive purpose become most sharply apparent. Faced with an undervaluation of what they do elsewhere, the humanities will project their most forceful self-image outside the discipline, albeit at the price of temporarily losing sight of the other kinds of activity they also foster. So some of what they do is just locally perceptive or entertaining or performative or funny or stylistically engaging. But in these circumstances, we put forward the stronger face. At such moments, when it's politically important to display the more aggressive edge, we can give a fuller description of the humanities. In the main, the humanities value qualitative above quantitative reasoning. They place greater faith in interpretative than in positivistic thinking, as the Commission has just reminded us. Unlike the sciences and the scientific wing of the social sciences, they do not have a dominant methodology. I need to gloss that, given what we were rightly reminded this morning by Kirsten. We do have methodologies, but they're plural and they evolve. And there is, I think, a substantial difference there from our colleagues in the sciences. And many of their truth claims are not verifiable as those of the natural sciences are verifiable. They tend, accordingly, to distrust proceduralism and to value independence of thought. They're oriented as much toward historical analysis as towards synchronic structural analysis, and as much toward the medium of expression as towards its content, tending to see the form-content distinction as problematic. They attend to the role of the perceiver in ascertaining even the most philosophically secure of knowledge claims, and they have an interest, often they also take pleasure, in the specificity of the object of study and the specificity of the individual response, its content and its style, over and above the generalized or collective response. Not least, they respect the products of past human endeavors in culture, even when superseded. Okay, it takes me a long time to get there in the book, but I give it to you in one digested paragraph, okay? That's as much as I'm going to say on this occasion about the definition of the humanities, though there's a great deal more that could be said about the way in which we proceed then to characterize the differences between what those of us in the humanities do and what those in the social sciences and sciences are doing. And actually, I think you nailed it in one sentence when you said you can flip snow over, but really we're in trouble if we start recreating the two cultures paradigm in a way that so many people now have tried to do with the three cultures paradigm, which in fact tends to split back to humanistic social sciences versus hard social sciences. You end up with a two cultures model again. Really what we need, I think, is a politics of alliance here, not a politics of conflict. Right, so here are the four further arguments then for the value of the humanities that have been influential historically and that seem to me still to exert some persuasive power. Each of them can yield more specific claims, which I'm going to treat here as logically subordinate or attendant, but which others might want to treat as distinctive and deserving of more notice in their own right. Together they offer a pluralistic account of value, and one of my working assumptions is that any good defence of the humanities has to be pluralistic, and that pluralism of this kind doesn't entail incoherence. I think there's an understandable move that happens when the humanities feel embattled, which is try to wield out the argument that will silence all opposition. So most recently it's been democracy needs us. There is no one argument that will do it because it depends what you think you're fighting, what you think you're contending with. So here are your plural defences. the usefulness claim, which we've just heard about from the Commissioner. The humanities are useful to society in ways that put pressure on how governments commonly understand use, especially the prioritisation of economic usefulness and the standard economic means of accounting for it. There is an old line of argument that the humanities are necessarily, some will say laudably, useless, or at a remove from accounts of practical ends and economic utility. This has been a common line of resistance to political economists from Adam Smith onwards, who have stressed usefulness as a desirable aim of publicly funded education. More recent advocates for the humanities have worked hard to invert the long-standing defence, arguing with good evidence that they make a significant contribution to the knowledge economy and to the economy proper, measurable in terms of the benefits to GDP, footfalls in bookshops, museums, theatres, heritage sites, not least students we train, and so forth. Though some who hang on to the old claim defend it absolutely and think that the value of the humanities is deformed or betrayed as soon as questions of utility or application are brought into consideration, a more plausible interpretation treats usefulness as a legitimate but only minor or secondary and often accidental aspect of humanities scholarship's public value. I'm particularly interested in the version of this moderate claim that sees the instrumental utility of the humanities as pertinent, highly pertinent to the evaluation of a basic primary or secondary education, where one is almost by definition dealing with forms of inquiry, but then diminishing as you go up the scale into higher education, where you're almost by definition dealing with forms of inquiry whose outcome is not predictable or not yet known. This tapering away of instrumental predictability will be less true for some other disciplines, notably medicine, the applied sciences and social sciences, and technology, but there will be a strong element of truth in the description wherever new and unfettered intellectual inquiry is involved. The third claim, second claim if you like, I call it the third claim. The humanities have a contribution to make to our individual and collective happiness. This may be the least trusted line of defence now. I'm not so sure. It certainly felt like it when I started working on this, but there has been a lot of work on happiness recently. It has a distinguished history and renewed topicality within governments at this time. Efforts to understand gains to the public good in ways that go deeper than economic benefits have received serious attention, as you all know, across the disciplines in recent years. And there have been warm encouragements to think of the emotions and passions as themselves goods. What I've tried to do in the book, but I can only sketch it out here gesturally, so you'll have to take it on trust, is to lay out the grounds for a qualitative hedonistic argument for the humanities, testing its weight as a means of rebalancing arguments that stress too exclusively their critical function. Now, the core assertion here is not the obviously overpitched one that the humanities will make you happy. It's rather, as John Stuart Mill set the terms of debate, that the humanities can help us to understand better what happiness is, how we may better put ourselves in the way of it, and how education may improve the kind and quality of some of the pleasures. So that's really my retake on what you were saying a minute ago. For John Stuart Mill, the impediment in the way of securing the larger claim that they can improve the quality of the society's happiness was the difficulty of persuading individuals interested in their own happiness and presumed to be egoistically motivated why they should care also for the collective or general well-being. That problem can still detain politicians. It's less likely to worry utilitarian philosophers for whom the goal just consists in individual psychological improvements. Okay, so you add them up. It's additive, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. To speak of a happy society is to deal in metaphor, since a society is not a psychological entity in the same way an individual is. On the other hand, we know what we mean when we use the phrase, a society and a polity whose agreed values and commitments assist the flourishing of the many and not the few. Okay, the fourth claim. You've heard it already. Democracy needs us. This is the most politically ambitious argument now regularly heard for the humanities in Britain. It's clearly a claim we would want to have on our side if we can make it secure. It has a proximate source in the American liberal arts tradition and a prominent recent exponent in Martha Nussbaum. Its longer roots lie in Socrates' claim to be a sort of gadfly given to the polis, which is why I was looking for support from Plato rather than Nero. I want to give it a slightly hard time here because it's an argument that goes almost without critical scrutiny in much advocacy for the humanities. No one's against democracy. Here are my cautions about it in short form, and then I'll put it back together for you. If the classical model is to work for us, we have to adapt and modernize what was in its origins a description of the philosopher as isolated adjutant, not as it now needs to be a description befitting institutionally based professionals. That's the least of our difficulties. I think we're much better now than we used to be about 10 or 20 years back at articulating the way in which our professional commitments are or should be underpinned by our democratic commitments. More pressingly, it's not automatically clear why this is as strong an argument for higher education as it is for primary and secondary education. Here we have to factor in the imperfect realization of the democratic goal of access. I'm sorry I don't have EU figures. I imagine there's at least one person in the audience who can just give them to me like that. The highest UK aspiration for attendance at university has been, under New Labour, 50%. The highest achieved figure has been 46%. Of the total enrolment of students there, as in most parts of the world, a diminishing percentage majors in the humanities. Though, in fact, if you look at the absolute numbers, it's been a story of ongoing increase. So currently over 15% in the UK. In the US, it seems to be just over 16%. So we also need to clarify better for ourselves why the democracy needs us claim doesn't commit us to a guardianship model of the democracy that most of us would, I think, instinctively resist. Shouldn't we rather trust in the capacities of ordinary, sufficiently educated people? Everything comes down to who's included in the us. If the us in democracy needs us is taken to refer to those of us who are scholars or students of the humanities in the universities, it does commit us, willingly or not, to a guardianship model of democracy. Rational coherence then requires us to accept, however reluctantly, that Plato and Mill were right, and that democracy left to itself is a noble but sluggish beast in need of our goading. But if the us is a bid for all members of the democracy to protect the good operation of the democracy by exercising our critical capacities, then humanities departments will be one place, an important one among many, nurturing those abilities. Democracy needs us is not a definitive claim. Okay? It comes into the frame of justifications for the humanities when we give a strong affirmative answer to the question, how political do you want your work to be? That is, it puts the needs of the democracy first, and it asks what the humanities can do to serve them. It rests finally on the status of the humanities as the specialist agency within the university for a kind of questioning and speculative thinking that should define a general ethos of learning and inquiry across all the disciplines. The humanities, centrally concerned as they are with the cultural practices of reflection, argument, criticism, advocacy, evaluation, and the speculative testing of ideas, have from that perspective a substantial contribution to make to the good working of democracy. Here again, it's worth spelling out that the strength of the current political assertion that the humanities have a larger or more important claim for value here rests on the observation, which is correct, I think, but it's also historically and politically contingent, that it has become theirs as a consequence of the downgrading of those kinds of thinking in other quarters of the university and or public life. Okay, it is still there. Does it feel like it's still there? I hope it feels like it's still there. The final claim I'm going to outline is that the humanities matter for their own sake. A common feature of all the other justifications I've been outlining for you is that they are consequentialist. They rest on a conviction that the humanities have good effects in the world by their impact on our cultural life, our happiness, our politics. That consequentialism is going to be attractive to anyone tasked with demonstrating the humanities' public benefit. But it neglects what has often been thought of as the intrinsic value of the objects studied. I've been noticing, reading through Leroux and the other documents that you will be so familiar with, just how important that phrase, intrinsic value, has become. And please don't take this back to David Willits, my Minister for Higher Education, in a negative phrase, but I was very struck. I had to give, when I was just starting this book, a spiel to a research showcase for Oxford at which David Willits was supposed to be present. It turned out to be a kind of disastrous day in the House of Commons in which he was available to give his speech and had to be rushed to the ministerial car and back to the House to vote. But he read the blurbs in advance, and he clearly read through the points because he ticked them all. And he stood there at the podium and said, intrinsic value, I absolutely believe in intrinsic value, at which point my sceptical mind goes, that is good, he believes in intrinsic value. That is bad. It's very easy to say without it actually holding on to something. So, okay. Intrinsic value has in fact been long something of a philosophical embarrassment, considered as a criterion for aesthetic and other modes of judgment. It runs counter to many critics' philosophers' understanding of how pervasively valuations are coloured by the perceiver's interests. It's also frequently hampered by being drawn into a mistaken opposition with instrumental value. I'm going to spare you on this occasion the close reading of Philosophy of Value. A sigh of relief ran around the room, and simply tell you that I think this isn't ground that humanities scholars have to be on, the intrinsic value ground. We may do better to argue for the value of the objects and practices that matter to us by calling on long-standing intuitions of value, which are often taken as self-evident by the wider public, and relatedly on the ground of long-standing cultural settlements and evolving agreements about how and why the humanities have value for their own sake, a value that's neither purely intrinsic nor more subjective. One of the points about for its own sake is simply that it's less fetishizable. Okay? As a phrase, it speaks to something simpler and as it should be more self-evident. The important point is that if you don't have a claim of that sort on the table, and in the end I don't really mind that much which version you prefer, but if you don't have a claim that comes down to it mattering for its own sake, for what it is in itself, then you're in trouble, because if you rely solely on the consequentialist or instrumentalist claims, there will usually be something that does the job better or more directly, or at least can claim to. All these frames for valuing the humanities need to be at the table, as it were, politically. There are and there will remain deep disagreements about whether the knowledge they pursue is an end in itself, or whether objects should be evaluated in terms of their instrumental use value or desire satisfaction, or the contribution higher level study of them can make to the quality of the democratic culture. But pursuing serious and informed reflection on these matters is in itself one of the definitional purposes of the humanities, and the preservation of that cultural good is among the reasons for valuing them. So these are the arguments that I've wanted to separate out taxonomically and test. Each of them is legitimate, though not without bounds on their legitimacy. Together, as I've said, they comprise the ground for a pluralistic defence of the value of the humanities. They're all reasons that apply to how we may want to think about the value of studying the humanities for ourselves and our children. Casting them into the ring of debate about the public value of the humanities, however, requires something more to be said. Advocating for the public value of the humanities constrains the nature of the debate in certain ways. It doesn't prohibit discussion of how, for example, they bring deep fulfillment to us personally and often give meaning and shape to our lives. I'm quoting David Willits. But it does require such statements to be supported by some sense of how these potential benefits to the individual contribute to public life. As pressingly, thinking of the public value of higher scholarship in the humanities requires one to be able to distinguish different aspects to the idea of a public good. The kinds of good represented by the study of the humanities are not all expressible as economic goods. At least one political theorist has argued that they're much better expressed as human goods, counting among the things that contribute either directly or indirectly to human well-being, and that are, of course, richly diverse and heterogeneous in character. They rarely, if ever, have the status of necessities. That is, it's hard to imagine circumstances under which they will meet the standard of basic requirement or vital interest entailed in the word need. Few things do. We have an absolute need of something when we can accurately say that to be deprived of it will be to experience harm or some serious impairment to our capacity to flourish. Air, food, peace, a roof over our heads, basic healthcare, education in our formative years. On the other hand, it's a sign of being a prosperous, stable, educationally and culturally rich society that we can come to experience as needs, things whose absence or diminishment would be, strictly speaking, a relative rather than an absolute impoverishment. What would be meant in such circumstances by claiming that public support for scholarship in the humanities is necessary is that it's strongly desired and that lessening that support would be an acutely felt impoverishment. Some people will want to say at this point that the language of need rightly expands its range in keeping with advancements in the wealth and complexity of the society concerned, that it comes to encompass the wish for prosperity. Given that absolute needs still exist in the world, even in highly advanced societies, it seems to me better to retain the clarity of the language and talk rather of our desires and interests and cultural attachments and ambitions as having a different priority from our needs and requiring a different order of justification. In short, there's a rudimentary distinction to be made between needs or vital interests and desires or interests or cultural attachments, which may be strong but not absolutely vital. Recognizing that these distinctions apply is only the first stage in comparative deliberation about public goods. The hard part of the problem is finding justifications for those non-necessary desirables that will enable meaningful comparison with other non-necessary desirables in a situation of practical deliberation. So, take out the necessities. What one's left with after that initial step are problems of judgment. of arbitration between the claims of what will often be seen as incommensurable goods. These judgments of value are not themselves economic in kind, though they may well be the means of deciding the allocation of finite economic resources. They will require debate about the relative importance in a given context of different values and commitments, many of which will not obviously be rankable on the same scale. There's a particular form of indignation familiar within discussions of the value of the humanities, which produces or accompanies an outright refusal to engage with comparisons between incommensurables. The gist of the indignation is that the good of the humanities cannot be weighed in the balance against most other kinds of public good. Because the goods entailed are not only incommensurable, lacking a common measure, but incomparable, unable to be compared with respect to some governing considerations such as beauty. So within the framework of university budgeting, this indignant response would say that we cannot measure the value of the humanities against the value of the sciences or social sciences, because the kinds of work they do are fundamentally unalike. Or within the more complex frameworks required to decide government budgets, we cannot weigh the claims of university research in the humanities against investments in new forms of energy or new hospitals or additional resources for the armed forces, because educating the nation, improving its health, increasing its capacity to defend itself and its allies are fundamentally non-comparable aims. Incomparabilities, some philosophers have argued, can be a constitutive, almost a definitive feature of certain goods. For example, there are some situations, Joseph Raz has argued, in which the judgment that two things are incomparable has symbolic significance for us, one partly determined by social conventions. So the idea that one would not trade friendship or the love of one's child or one's spouse for any amount of money finds from most of us emphatic approval, and invitations to do otherwise meet with strong resistance or indeed revulsion. Such judgments may well prove upon close inspection not to be absolute. There will be circumstances in which one might act directly or more often indirectly in such a way as to give the acquisition of money apparent priority over the claims of friendship or family, for example. But Raz concludes that certain judgments about the non-comparability of certain options and certain attitudes to the exchangeability of options are constitutive of relations with friends, spouses, parents, etc. Only those who hold the view that friendship is neither better nor worse than money, but is simply not comparable to money or other commodities, are capable of having friends. With regard to the problem under discussion, then, we might take the view that only those who hold that higher scholarship in the humanities is neither better nor worse than the pursuit of economic or commercial gain, is simply not comparable to such ends-driven activity, are capable of producing humane scholarship. In other words, if you don't get it, you're inhumane. So we worry sometimes that our language is weak. Sometimes our language can be very strong. Such objections to comparisons between some abstract values are, I suspect, likely to appeal to many scholars of the humanities. They are certainly implicit in much casual talk about the public value of what we do. But in practice, of course, comparisons between incomparable goods are made all the time. I don't need to tell that to most of you in the room. We all know that many people regularly reach successful decisions in such difficult circumstances for deliberation, and are subsequently prepared to pronounce on the relative importance of the considerations that led them to their decision. How they do it depends largely on what framing ideas and values they hold about what will best advance the overall happiness of a life. Many of those values are bequeathed to us, but they are not unchallengeable dicta, as Elijah Milgram, the philosopher, puts it. So we may tell our children to do and value certain things that belong to our own picture of the well-lived life, but we also expect them to form their own judgments and quite possibly change those judgments in the course of their lives, not least because their cultural experience and the context in which their society deliberates public goods will be different from ours. The appeal to a framing idea of what makes for a fulfilling life seems likely to invite dispute in the case of the value of the humanities. In other words, we can't constrain the people who don't get it, who think, for example, that it's all about maximizing financial improvements. There is indeed good cause to observe that the implied analogy between how governments or societies reach decisions about allocating finite public resources and how individuals prioritize different values and commitments in their own lives is helpful only up to a point. Beyond that point, we need rather to be able to draw on impersonal justifications that describe what goods we collectively think a complex society and culture should continue to support. On the other hand, as Bernard Williams observed at an early stage in the debate about pluralism and incommensurability, we will find ourselves in trouble as a society if the ways in which we express and encourage important values drift too far from our private sentiments and intuitions about values. Private understanding, he said, can live with a good deal of intuition and unresolved conflict. Public order, unless we're to give up the ethical ambition that it be answerable, can only live with less. At the same time, the public order, if it is to carry conviction and also not to flatten human experience, has to find ways in which it can be adequately related to private sentiment, which remains more intuitive and open to conflict than public rules can be. Not the least contribution the humanities can make to the public good is that they offer long-considered and finely developed ways of thinking about what the nature of that relationship should be. To go further here and fabricate a hypothetical scenario in which the humanities' claim to public money is tested against specific claims from the NHS, the Army, and so forth would be spurious. In practice, as you all know, distributions at this level of comparison are decided largely on the basis of past allocations. The more relevant comparisons may be the ones nearer in kind, say doctoral research versus public subsidy for the arts, or funding for certain humanities projects versus others in the social sciences or sciences. These are finally matters for debate and judgment around a table with detailed and current contextual data at hand. In practice and in principle, what matters if the debate and the judgment are to command respect is that those participating have a sufficiently plural and internally refined or refinable understanding of the modes of justification and valuation that support each rival claimant for public funding. If the taxonomy I've outlined here and the refinements supplied in support of each claim can make it easier to see what those supports are for the humanities, it will have done enough. Thank you very much.